Wyoming Territory, 1879. The cold wind tore through the sagebrush hills as if it carried warning, but still she ran. Josephine Garner's boots hit the frozen ground hard, each breath sharp in her chest. Her skirts were torn, her bonnet long lost back on the ridge. Behind her, the town of Elk Hollow shrank, and with it, the promise her father made, the one that would have chained her to a man twice her age for the sake of cattle and land. She had not cried when her father told her 2 days ago. She had simply packed what she could carry and waited until the house fell quiet. Now, with the sky darkening and her hands raw from cold, she kept moving west toward the high country. The land opened wide ahead, pine-covered ridges, snow-dusted peaks, nothing but God and wilderness. She did not know where she would go, only that she could not go back. A gunshot cracked behind her. Josephine dropped behind a rock outcropping, heart hammering. Another shot rang out, closer this time, then hoofbeats. She pressed herself to the stone, breath held. "Miss," the voice was deep, steady, and too close. "I ain't with them. You can come out if you want to live." Still she waited, unsure, then boots crunched snow nearby, slow and deliberate. A shadow appeared, tall and broad-shouldered. His hat was low over his brow, his coat dusted with frost. He did not lift his rifle, just held it loosely at his side. "I saw you run from town. They're coming after you, 3 men on horseback. One of them has a red scarf. You know them?" She rose slowly. "One of them's supposed to be my husband." He looked at her then, really looked. "You do not want that?" "No," she said, voice cracking. "I do not." He nodded once. "Come on." She hesitated. "Who are you?" "Malcolm Harlow," he said. "I got a cabin 2 miles down. You will freeze out here." Josephine followed. She did not know why, only that the way he said her name when she gave it soft and without pity made something inside her settle for the first time in days. Malcolm led her through a narrow pass, pine needles crunching underfoot. The sun dipped low, throwing gold across the snow. Below the ridge, a small log cabin came into view, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, it was warm, quiet, and smelled of pine and coffee. Josephine stood near the fire while Malcolm poured water into a kettle. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. "Sit. You are safe here." She sat. Her hands trembled, not from cold now, but from everything catching up, the fear, the anger, the weight of what she had done. She had fled her life. There was no going back. Malcolm brought her a plate of beans and cornbread. She ate slowly, watching him move around the room. He was quiet but not cold, careful, like a man who knew what silence was good for. "They will come looking," she said after a while. "They will not find you. You do not even know me." His gaze met hers. "I know enough." That night she slept on his cot while he built a bedroll near the fire. She expected sleep to evade her, but it came fast and deep. And when she woke, the first thing she saw was Malcolm placing another log on the fire, his back to her, the morning light soft on his shoulders. 2 days passed. He taught her how to stack kindling, how to walk quiet in the snow, how to listen for wolves. He did not ask questions she was not ready to answer. When she did speak about the man she had been promised to, about her father, about the way her mother had died with grief in her eyes, Malcolm only nodded, never interrupting. On the 3rd night, someone came. Josephine heard the crunch of hooves first. Then the creak of saddle leather outside. Malcolm was already at the door, rifle in hand. She stood behind him. "Stay back," he said. A knock. Then a voice. "We know she is in there, Cowboy. She has promised. We got papers." Malcolm opened the door and stepped out. Josephine watched through the crack. "You ride back to Elk Hollow," Malcolm said. "She is not going anywhere with you," the man in the red scarf spat. "You hiding a thief now. She is not stolen. She is free. Not by law." Malcolm raised his rifle, slow and steady. "You take another step and I will make sure your boots never walk again." The man's hand hovered near his holster, but one of the others tugged his reins. "Come on, he is not bluffing." They rode off. Malcolm came back inside, jaw tight. "You should not have done that," Josephine said. He looked at her, voice low. "I could not watch you be taken." She stepped close, heart loud in her chest. "Why?" His voice was quiet. "Because I care what happens to you." Josephine's hand brushed his. I care what happens to you too. He looked down at her, searching her face. You do not owe me anything. I know, she said, but I still want to be here. Malcolm's hand touched her cheek. Then stay. She leaned up, pressed her lips softly to his. He kissed her back, slow and certain, as if he had been waiting for this but would never have asked. That night they stayed close by the fire. No more words, just warmth, just hands held, just the quiet beginning of something real. Josephine had fled a cruel promise, but she had not run into nothing. She had run into someone who stood between her and the darkness, someone who saw her not as property, not as a duty, but as a woman worth guarding, and that changed everything. The snow began to pull back from the hills by early March, revealing patches of dry grass and pale earth beneath the trees. Water ran fast in the creeks now, fed by thaw and sun, and the wind no longer bit so hard. Malcolm had taken to splitting wood again in the mornings. Shirt sleeves rolled as he worked beside the shed, while Josephine fed the hens he'd bartered for last fall from a trapper's wife down in Lander. She felt different in the changing light, not safe, not entirely but steadier. The days slid into a rhythm neither of them named. She rose early, swept the hearth, stirred oats with dried berries when they had them. Malcolm said little over breakfast, but sometimes he would glance up from his cup, eyes resting on her face like he was memorizing it. She'd grown used to the silence between them. It didn't press down like before. It held space. One morning, as she poured water into the basin to wash her hands, Malcolm came in from the barn, his boots tracked in dirt, and there was a smear of something dark on his sleeve. Tree came down near the fence, he said, pulling off his gloves. Cracked the top rail, elk must have leaned on it. I'll come help mend it, she said. He looked at her a long moment before nodding. You know how to set a brace post? No, she admitted, drying her hands on her apron. But I'm willing to learn. They walked out together, past the ridge where snow still clung in shadows. The fence line stretched along the south end of the pasture, and the broken post leaned like a drunk against its neighbor. Malcolm showed her how to dig out the rotten wood, how to tamp the earth hard around the new one. Her fingers blistered, but she didn't stop. When they finished, she leaned on the shovel, wind lifting strands of her hair. You work like you were raised to it, he said, brushing sawdust from his palms. We had a mule farm in Kansas before we moved west, she said. My father didn't believe in idleness. Malcolm didn't speak right away. Then, that farm still yours? No, she said, voice steady. He sold it to buy cattle and move us higher up. Said the air would be good for my mother's lungs. She died 2 weeks after we arrived. He nodded once. You miss her. Every day. Her throat tightened, but she didn't turn away. She used to hum while she stitched. I can't remember the tune anymore, just the shape of it in the room. Malcolm's eyes didn't leave hers. He reached out, slow as dusk, and brushed a fleck of dirt from her cheekbone. You don't ever have to forget her. She didn't look away. I don't want to forget you either. They stood like that until a hawk passed overhead, its cry sharp against the sky. Later, inside, she sat by the window stitching a torn sleeve while Malcolm worked a leather strap with his knife. The fire crackled and the day slid toward dusk. He didn't ask what she was making, and she didn't ask what he was carving. The quiet between them had deepened into something with shape and weight. You ever think about going farther west? She asked, not looking up from her thread. I did once, he said, before the war. Thought I'd see the Pacific, never made it past Fort Bridger. Why not? Found myself with nothing but a busted horse and a letter I couldn't bring myself to send. She looked at him then. To who, my brother? He died outside Chattanooga. I didn't know until I came back. Josephine set her sewing down. You stayed here because of him? I stayed because I didn't know where else belonged. Silence settled again, but now there was no distance in it. When she rose, walked over, and sat beside him on the bench, he didn't move away. I think you belong here, she said. He looked at her hands, then took one in his. So do you. That night, they didn't part ways after supper. She followed him to the cot, and when he turned, she placed her hand against his chest. He didn't pull her in, not at first, just looked at her like he was seeing something he'd never believed was meant for him. Then she leaned up and kissed him, and he let his arms wrap around her, slow and sure. They didn't speak as they undressed. They didn't rush. There was no hunger in it, only the steady unfolding of trust, of warmth, of shared breath and skin. After, with her head tucked beneath his chin, Josephine whispered, "You never asked me to stay." "I didn't need to," he said. "You already had." She slept with his hand over her heart, the weight of it anchoring her in a way nothing ever had outside. The wind had quieted, and the stars burned clear above the ridge. Spring was still weeks off, but inside the cabin, something had already taken root. By late April, the river had swollen past its banks, and the meadow below the cabin gleamed with standing water. Ducks nested in the reeds, and the scent of damp soil crept through the cracks in the chinking. Josephine leaned against the doorframe, sleeves rolled as she worked a whetstone along a blade Malcolm had left beside the basin. She didn't ask why he'd been sharpening it every evening, only learned the angle by watching. "Storm's coming," Malcolm said behind her, his hat in one hand, his voice low from the walk back. She didn't turn. "From which side?" "East. You can smell it on the wind." Josephine set the blade down carefully. "You find what you needed in town," he nodded, stepping inside. Mud clung to his boots and his coat sagged with rain. He carried a folded wool parcel in one arm and a long, narrow box in the other. He set the box on the table without a word. She'd never seen him bring anything back for himself. "What's that?" "Something for you." She raised her brow. "I didn't ask for anything." "You didn't have to." She opened the box slowly. Inside, nestled in linen, was a pair of women's boots, sturdy, low-heeled with clean stitching and new soles. She ran her thumb along the leather. "These are too good." "They're yours." She looked up. "Why?" "Because the ones you came in with wouldn't last another mile," he said. "And if you ever need to walk away, I want you to have strong footing." Her throat tightened. "I'm not going anywhere." He gave a short nod, then turned to hang up his coat. She traced the edge of the boot sole again, heart thick behind her ribs. That night, the storm Malcolm had smelled dragged itself over the hills. Wind slammed into the cabin like a fist, and rain clattered against the roof like shot. The fire hissed low in the hearth. Josephine sat on the floor, back against the wall, while Malcolm read from a worn copy of The Prairie Traveler by lantern light, his voice even and unhurried. "You ever think about heading farther north?" she asked, eyes on the flame. He closed the book, thumb marking the page. "Why north?" "I heard the land's different up there. Fewer people, less watching. You looking to disappear again?" She met his eyes. "No, just wondering if we could start something new, not just hide." He rested the book on his knee. "You saying you'd want to build something with me?" "I'm not saying it if you won't hear it." "I hear you." They sat quiet as the wind howled. Outside, something heavy fell against the shed. Malcolm didn't rise. He only leaned back, arm resting along the bench beside him. Josephine pushed herself up and crossed the room. She sat beside him, knees drawn up, shoulder to his. "Did you ever love anyone before?" she asked without looking. "Once," he said. "Before the war, I was too young to know what I wanted. She married someone else while I was away. Do you think you would have stayed with her if things had gone different?" "No." "Why not?" He turned his head slowly toward her. "Because she wasn't you." She didn't answer, just leaned her head against his shoulder and let the storm pass. The next morning, Malcolm found a deer trail that led down toward the creek, its tracks still wet in the mud. They followed it together, Josephine with a rifle balanced over her shoulder, Malcolm carrying a coil of rope. They moved in silence, not from tension but from knowing each other's pace. At the water's edge, they found the remnants of a camp ash, a broken wagon wheel, and a scattering of buttons near a tree stump. Josephine crouched beside the wheel. "This wasn't here before." "No," Malcolm said. "Someone passed through in the night." She stood slowly. "You think they saw the cabin?" "If they did, they didn't stop." They walked back without speaking. But that night, Malcolm laid the rifle beside the door instead of above it, and Josephine didn't ask why. Later, as she folded linens by lantern light, she said, "You think the men from Elk Hollow gave up?" "No. You think they'll come again?" "Yes." She nodded once, then finished folding. We'll be ready." He crossed the room and set his hand on her hip, grounding her. "I don't need you to fight for me. I'm not fighting for you," she said. "I'm fighting beside you." He leaned in then, forehead brushing hers. "That's what I meant." She kissed him slow then, with both hands steady on his chest, and he kissed her back like nothing in him doubted it anymore. They stood that way for a long time, not hiding, not waiting, just choosing, quiet and sure. Outside, the last of the storm water drained into the earth and the hills began to green under a pale, rising sun. By the second week of May, the cottonwoods had leafed out in soft green, and the ridge trails dried enough for Malcolm to lead the mare farther than he had all winter. Josephine stood on the porch that morning, one hand wrapped around a mug of chicory brew, watching the line of his shoulders as he saddled the packhorse. "You sure you need to go today?" she asked, voice still rough with sleep. "There's a man outside Fort Washakie," Malcolm said, adjusting the cinch. "Half Shoshone, half French, knows how to track from wind alone. If those men come again, I want to know before I see their dust." Josephine stepped down onto the grass, the hem of her dress brushing against the new shoots. "You trust him?" "I trust how he reads the ground." She didn't answer right away, just reached for the reins and checked the lead strap herself. "How long?" "2 nights, maybe 3. Josephine looked up at him, eyes steady. "I'll keep the lamp burning." Malcolm nodded once, then leaned down and kissed her just below the corner of her mouth, his beard still damp from the basin. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." She watched him ride out along the tree line, his figure narrowing with the distance until the pines swallowed him whole. When the sound of hooves finally faded, she exhaled slow through her nose and turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the air still held the warmth from the morning fire. She filled the basin, wiped the table clean, and checked the rifle by the door. She'd never lived alone before, not truly, but she didn't feel afraid, only aware. She spent the daylight hours tending to the garden rows they'd cleared together, onions, turnips, and a few hard beans that might catch root if the frost stayed gone. She didn't hum, didn't talk to herself. Just listened to the crows, to the rustle of deer in the brush, to the pulse of the land as it shifted around her. That night, she took Malcolm's coat from the peg and laid it over the bench where he always sat. It smelled faintly of pine pitch and saddle leather. She slept with the rifle propped beside the bed, one hand resting near the butt. No one came. The second morning, she followed the creek east, keeping low and quiet. She found fresh rabbit tracks near the bend and set 2 snares. On the way back, she spotted a rust-colored scarf tangled in the low branches of a juniper, half a mile from the cabin. She didn't touch it. When Malcolm returned the next evening, dusk settling cold and pale around his shoulders, her hands were already on the rifle. She didn't lower it until she saw the worn hat and the familiar gait of his horse. He dismounted slow, eyes sweeping the ridge. "You see it?" "I left it where it was." He took the rifle from her gently, checked the chamber, then looked at her face. "You all right?" "I stayed ready." He nodded. "Good." They didn't speak more until after supper. He'd brought back strips of smoked trout and a small carved whistle from the tracker, who'd told him to listen for a pair of crows flying low in the evening and calling once. That would mean riders on the ridge. Josephine turned the whistle over in her hand, its surface smooth from years of use. "You believe in signs like that?" "I believe in a man who's lived longer than I have." They sat close by the hearth, his thigh pressed to hers, not for comfort but because neither moved away. "You ever think about what comes after?" she asked. He looked at her, brow drawn. "After what? All this, the watching, the waiting when no one's looking for me anymore." "I think about it every time I wake up beside you." She didn't smile. Just leaned into him, her temple resting against his shoulder. "I want to put in a second room," he said after a while, "off the back. Summer'll be dry enough to raise the frame." Her eyes lifted. "You want to build more?" "I didn't before," he said. "Now I do." She rose then, took his hand and led him to the cot without a word. They undressed each other like it was the first time again, no rush, no need, just the quiet urgency of belonging. When he pressed his lips to her collarbone, she sighed once long and low and slid her fingers through the back of his hair. Afterward, she traced the line of his jaw with her thumb. "You ever want children?" His hand rested over hers. "Only if you do." "I think I do," she said. "Someday." "With you?" He didn't answer. Just kissed her palm and pulled her close, their bodies fitting the way they always had in trust in choice in the silent language they'd built between them. Outside, the moon pushed through the clouds, casting long silver light across the cabin roof. The wind had quieted and the trees stood still. Listening, by early June, the sky had turned the color of hammered pewter in the evenings, and the wild columbine bloomed violet and pale gold under the aspens. Josephine stood barefoot in the soft earth behind the cabin, hands deep in the soil, planting the last row of carrots before the heat set in. Behind her, the sound of a saw moved steady and clean through fur. Malcolm had begun framing the new room 2 days earlier, marking lines with a carpenter's pencil he'd whittled down to a nub. He worked shirtless in the afternoons, sweat darkening the waist of his trousers, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. Josephine never interrupted him, but sometimes she brought him a tin cup of cool water, and sometimes he'd catch her watching and say nothing at all. That morning, she traded eggs and 2 jars of pickled beets to a traveling peddler passing near the ridge. In exchange, she'd received a bolt of pale cotton and a set of embroidery needles wrapped in cloth. She hadn't embroidered since Kansas. The feel of the needle between her fingers, the pull of thread through muslin, brought back a part of herself she hadn't touched in years. By supper, Malcolm had hoisted 2 walls and braced them with planks. The space would be narrow, but long enough for a second bed if they needed it, or a cradle. He didn't say it aloud, and neither did she, but when he measured the window height, he asked, "Should it be lower?" Josephine nodded once. Yes. They ate outside that evening, sitting on the stacked lumber while the last of the sun lit the grass gold. She passed him a plate of skillet bread and salted trout, and he ate with quiet satisfaction, wiping his hands on his trousers before tearing off another piece. "I've been thinking," she said, resting her elbows on her knees. "We ought to make something official." He looked at her, chewing slowly. "You mean the land, I mean us." He set the plate down beside him. "You want a preacher? I want a promise that holds, with or without a book." Malcolm didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch, tied at the top with a strip of leather. He handed it to her. Josephine opened it carefully. Inside was a ring, plain brass, worn smooth at the edges. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it until the day she died. I kept it in a tobacco tin until last week." Josephine held it between her fingers. "It's beautiful. It's not new." "I don't want new." She slipped it onto her finger. It fit snug as if it had waited for her. He took her hand in his, warm and rough. "You want to say words?" he asked. "I think we already have." They sat in silence a moment longer, watching the last light fade behind the hill. The next morning, Malcolm rode to Lander to file a land claim in both their names. Josephine stayed behind, mending the hem of the calico curtain and boiling water for cleaning. When he returned, he carried a paper folded 4 times over and sealed with a wax stamp. He handed it to her without a word, and she tucked it into the cedar box beside her mother's brooch. That night, she lit the oil lamp while he finished hanging the last beam. The new room still smelled of fresh cut timber and sawdust, but the window caught the moonlight just right. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed gently, watching him secure the final nail. "You've built it strong," she said. "I built it for staying." They lay together in the new room on a fresh stuffed mattress laid over planks. He pulled the quilt over their shoulders and her hand found his under the edge without looking. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "You do now, no more hiding. No more running. Just a home built by 2 hands and a life stitched from days shared. Years passed with the quiet speed of honest labor." The cabin grew by another room the following spring, and with it, the arrival of a child whose cry first broke the stillness just as the sun touched the pines. Josephine named her Clara, for the clear-eyed girl her mother had once been, and Malcolm held her like something sacred. They raised chickens and kept bees, traded soap for flour and letters for stories. Josephine embroidered names into linen, and Malcolm taught Clara to hold a hammer straight. No one ever came looking again. On their 10th summer, Josephine planted a row of columbine along the fence, and Malcolm built a bench beneath the cottonwood near the creek. They sat there often at dusk, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting easy over hers, the sky wide and unbothered above them. They never spoke of Elk Hollow again. There was no need. They had chosen each other, not from desperation, but from the quiet certainty that love, once earned, needed no declaration louder than a life lived hand in hand.